So everyone on the planet needs to understand the impact that climate change is going to have on them. Whether it's government, a company, an individual, they're all impacted in some way. And Jupiter has the best solution in the world for helping those entities understand the impact of climate change in terms that are relevant to them. What we've been very good at is finding the segments that have said, yeah, we now think climate change is going to be important to our business or our society in some way, and they're ready to work with us.
Hi, folks. I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus in Conversation, a podcast where we're talking to the innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who are committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. As you all probably know about me by now, I may have mentioned it a few times on the podcast, I'm an inveterate entrepreneurship nerd and a former investment banker, which means I love reading business and leadership books. And when you do that, you start to notice that the most popular business writing is not really about business at all. It's actually more about psychology. And that makes sense, because making the most profitable decisions requires us to understand how we arrive at decisions in the first place. To avoid making mistakes, we want to know why we make them. In a recent episode featuring Christy Keeler of Trashy, we talked about the cognitive bias known as the Bader-Meinhof effect. Some of the biggest mistakes we make in business can often be traced back to cognitive biases, because they distort our perception and make it harder to predict the future. Understanding such biases and how to spot them correctly in our own thinking can mean the difference between overestimating a niche or correctly anticipating the next big idea before everyone else and building for it. So I want to talk about another important bias today. And to illustrate it, I want you to take a second to answer this question. If a random word is taken from the English language, is it more likely to start with letter K, or is it more likely to have K as its third letter? Okay, got your answer? Well, barring those of you who are already aware of this study, there's about a 70% chance that you said it starts with letter K. But in reality, English texts on average include words with K as the third letter twice as often as they begin with the letter K. In fact, up until this point in our conversation, there have been 4 words starting with K and 8 with K as the third letter. It was genuinely unintentional, but it does illustrate the point quite nicely. The fact that 70% of us miss on this question exemplifies one of the more common cognitive biases, availability bias. Essentially, our perception of the frequency of a particular occurrence is directly tied to the ease with which we can think of examples of that occurrence. It's fairly easy to think of words that begin with the letter K, kite, king, kangaroo, but it takes a bit more time and effort to try to recall words with K as the third letter. That's understandable, since we don't often identify words by their third letter. But it does blind us to an objective fact that such words are, in fact, substantially more common. Okay, but so what? Well, where it starts to become important is when we try to assess the frequency or probability of more tangible types of events happening. Here's another very famous example of availability bias that I bet you have heard of in some form. As many as 38% of Americans admit to being so scared of sharks they won't go in the ocean at all. And yet, each year, more people are killed by vending machines than sharks. Shark attacks get a lot more media attention precisely because they are so unusual, but that amount of coverage makes them stick out in our mind and skews our perception of their frequency and the risk they pose to us. When it comes to protecting themselves against a likely threat, those 38% of Americans would be technically better served going ahead and getting in the ocean and skipping the Coke from the machine on the boardwalk. But, and this is connected to something really important that my guest today is going to talk about, do you want to know another interesting little tidbit about the vending machine versus shark factoid? It's not true, or it's not true anymore. Despite being a routine fixture in media like the Discovery Channel and being cited as recently as 2021 by experts like the head of the Shark Conservation Lab, data is from 1995. Vending machines have actually gotten a lot safer since then. In fact, according to the Consumer Product Safety Commission, there have been 0 vending machine-related deaths since 2008. As of the last available comparative data, you actually are more likely to get killed by a shark than a vending machine. Only very marginally more likely, because shark attacks are still extremely rare, but more likely nevertheless. It's a crucial reminder of a little axiom that all of us in investment banking were quite familiar with. If you've ever written or read a prospectus, you recognize the phrase, past performance is not indicative of future results. This truth, in conjunction with the availability bias, makes humans basically really bad at accurately assessing risk unaided. Even when we remember our facts about probability correctly, which we often don't, those facts that were true yesterday aren't necessarily still true today, and almost certainly might not be true tomorrow. This becomes especially vexing when analyzing the risk of a problem as immense and complex and unprecedented as our changing climate. And yet, even with the most optimistic decarbonization outlooks, the effects of climate change are going to be vast and highly disruptive to the ways that we've gotten used to doing things. Managing the risks posed by climate change to operations like supply chain, construction, and land management is going to be a critical component of successful business planning for the foreseeable future. Fortunately, while humans are not very good at predicting these risks on our own, we're pretty amazing at creating and harnessing technology to do it for us. And I'm super excited this week to bring you this conversation with one of the leading figures in climate risk technology. Rich Sorkin is the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Jupiter Intelligence, a climate risk analytics firm using cutting-edge science, up-to-the-minute data, and advanced modeling to provide companies and other organizations with actionable insights for building resilience and mitigating the effects of climate change on their business. Rich has had a truly remarkable career in technology and entrepreneurship. Honestly, I could have spent a whole episode just picking his brain about the tech industry, what he's seen and helped to shape. Apple, Creative Labs, Zip2, you name the tech innovation over the last 2 decades, there's a good chance that Rich was right there catching that wave. And now, bringing cloud computing and generative AI modeling to the fight against climate change, he's doing it again. I had such a blast chatting with Rich to learn about what he's doing with Jupiter. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. All right. Looking good? Feeling good?
Absolutely, Billy Ray.
I like it. You got the reference.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for doing this. Super excited to get the whole Jupiter story, but you have such a rich background, no pun intended, with so many incredible experiences that I really want to dig into. I want to start at the beginning though, because you have, for your entire career, you've been really at the vanguard of both the technology revolution and entrepreneurship. I'm curious if you kind of look back to growing up. Did you always know you wanted to be an entrepreneur running businesses? Did you always love technology? Was one more prominent than the other? Where did they collide?
Yeah. So I have a lifelong interest in technology, as programming computers as a kid, and also expected that I would do something in the business world. Candidly, I didn't have much exposure to the entrepreneurial world until I came out to California for business school. And then, sort of in the mix and pretty compelling at that point.
I mean, we've talked with a lot of Bay Area founders, obviously, and particular folks that came out of not just the business school side of things, but a ton of engineering kids from, Stanford and your grad school alma mater. I want to actually spend a couple minutes on your education because, again, it's incredibly impressive. Yale economics for undergrad, Stanford GSB for business school. I want to hear a little bit about that. And in particular, I love that you spent some time as a research assistant for William Nordhaus. So I guess let's start with, what was it like to work for a future Nobel Prize winner?
Well, at the time, Bill was best known as a former member of the Council of Economic Advisors. And that was pretty prominent. But, there are quite a few Nobel laureates in economics walking around Yale. And, in general, Yale's a pretty heady place. So you get used to being around quite prominent and successful folks. In my interactions with Bill, it was, kind of a regular person. He had expectations of what he wanted to accomplish with the book that he was writing. It was pretty clear. I worked on that, and it was pretty straightforward.
And you're working with him on reforming federal regulation. I'm curious, how that shaped your thinking when it comes to roles and opportunities around policy and policy's impact on business. And I'd love to kind of get your take on it.
Yeah. So just to be clear, Reforming Federal Regulation was the book that he was working on.
Yes. Sorry. Yes. In italics.
I think the big insight that Nordhaus brought to that book was to think about regulation from a cost-benefit approach. There are significant cost regulations and there are benefits, and sort of getting that just right is important, which ultimately, we didn't know this at the time, but ultimately was kind of a core thesis of the DICE model, which is, sort of what are the costs, what are the benefits of investing in mitigation. A lot of people think some of the assumptions around the costs were too modest and has influenced the policy environment in some way. But generally, that approach has definitely been prevalent in the way that I think about the role of government.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's interesting, right? He won the Nobel Prize partially for integrating climate change into a macroeconomic analysis. So I'm curious kind of if you see the parallels or how you integrate the parallels to your own career. It seems like there's a common thread that comes back to the forefront.
Yeah, I mean, as I think about building businesses, I think there are three fundamental drivers. One is the readiness of the technology for widespread use. The second is the awareness of the problem that we're tackling. And the third is just the cost point, both the cost of delivering the service and the cost to implement the service relative to the benefits that that's delivering. So I think there's a commonality in terms of the cost benefit approach, but things are changing so much more rapidly in the technology business than they are with climate change. So, if you look at what we're doing at Jupiter with climate change, our focus is on helping our customers understand the impact of climate change so that they can make effectively rational, oftentimes economically driven, rational decisions about what's the right level of investment and changes in their infrastructure, changes in their processes to adapt to something that's inevitably coming for them.
I mean, let's kind of just think through your career, which is, again, I can't do justice to all the incredible places you've been and teams you've led. But one of the things that you've said when you've looked back, I think, is that one of the themes of your career has been really to think about how to leverage emerging technologies. And so, as you look back on all of your career and the lessons learned, how do you think you do that? How do you leverage emerging technology? How do you think about leveraging technologies? How do you suggest entrepreneurs apply that lens to their work?
Yeah. So I think the very first thing is to think about timing and the readiness of the technology before you even can leverage it. So if you look at my career, sort of the two biggest things that I've done prior to Jupiter were creative labs, where we're essentially deploying audio components into PCs and radically changing the nature of the PC architecture. So it went from being this kind of standard visual thing to truly a multimedia device. And then secondly, Zip2, where we're essentially delivering information about buying local services via the internet and sort of leveraging that internet infrastructure. In both cases, there was something much bigger that was happening, which was first, the power of the computer had gotten complex enough that it actually could process multimedia information, audio and video. I think a lot of listeners can't imagine a time when computers alone had multimedia capabilities, audiovisual in particular, but there was a time. And then sort of once it was powerful enough to do that, then there was a very big set of applications that were enabled by that. The same thing was true with the internet, right? So in the very early days of the internet, it was more of a communications vehicle. It only later became a multimedia vehicle in the way that we're used to today. But at the time that it was an information vehicle, there are all sorts of applications that could be developed on top of that for things like purchase decisions and shopping, which again, Zip2 was kind of at the forefront of. And then, with Jupiter, the insight there was that the cloud infrastructure was mature enough and again, powerful enough. And keep in mind, this was 7 years ago, that we could do very, very sophisticated modeling around the impact of climate change in a way that previously had been restricted to supercomputers and large government entities. And the hypothesis that we had was we could just go a lot faster as a private company leveraging the cloud than what was happening in the government labs, which actually turned out to be the case.
Yeah. I mean, thinking about kind of sitting at the precipice of emerging technology, do you find yourself with a rubric that you utilize to understand or appreciate, this is something that has traction, this is something that will be real, this is something that we should integrate into our planning or innovation curve ourselves? What is your kind of mental checklist for dissecting and analyzing emerging technologies and the potential?
Yeah, so I look at the kind of trend lines or curves for ease of use, cost, and broader adoption, right? And if you wait until it's cheap, easy, and everyone knows about it, it's too late. But you can see the trends, right? For example, the precursor company to Jupiter, Zeus, both companies are named for Greek and Roman gods of weather. At that time, our thesis was that cloud computing was going to be mature enough that we could leverage it. And that was almost a decade before we started Jupiter. And, it turned out one of the things that we missed was actually the tooling around using the cloud computing. So we sort of expected the ease of use to get better faster than ultimately turned out to be the case. And, it's impossible to know the three trends all with perfect accuracy.
Right.
Sometimes you get them right, sometimes you don't.
So let's talk a little bit more about Creative Labs and Zip2. Like, how did you end up in those roles, and how did they set the trajectory for then what became kind of the next few chapters in your tech journey?
Yeah, great question. And very different stories for both of them in terms of the underlying dynamics. I think a common theme throughout my career has been, finding really smart, successful people as collaborators, whether they're investors or teammates or folks on the team as individual contributors. And at Creative, the general manager of the division that I got hired to work in was someone that I'd worked for twice before in my career. And he was very successful. And so that was sort of the entree point. And then once I had the opportunity, I looked at what they were doing, and it was very clear. I had, again, coincidentally at Goldman, I had worked with the banker that helped take them public about a year before I joined. And, he said, this company is a rocket ship. It's just a question of how high it's going to go. So the trajectory on Creative was pretty clear at the time that I joined. And it was more just having the opportunity to run, at the time, one of the fastest growing businesses in Silicon Valley.
That's amazing. And then Zip2, what was the kind of story there?
Yeah, Zip2 is more kind of right place, right time. So this is, 1996. Netscape was really just emerging on the scene. You had, cover stories about Netscape and browsers and the internet, but there wasn't a lot being done. It was, it's kind of a huge amount of hype. And there was an enormous amount of venture money going into internet startups at that point in time. And, because of what I'd just done at Creative, I'd grown the business from about 40 million to 250 million. And the company had grown from about 250 million to $1.5 billion, all in 3 years. And, we had established a very, very strong leadership position. We were investing in internet companies at the time, and I was on point for that. So I'd gotten to know a number of the leading venture investors in that era. I was sitting on boards and co-investing with them. And so, the venture firms, they look for CEOs out of central casting, right? That there's a type. And at that moment in time, there were, maybe 10, 20 of us that all had kind of the ideal profile to run an early stage company based on the things that we'd done before and sort of our risk tolerance based on where we were in our careers. And so it was a magic moment. And I had my choice of different companies at the time. And Zip2, because it was unique and what it was doing with local information, was the one that I chose to go to. And I was very excited about that opportunity and what we built.
As you look at those two experiences in particular, any kind of big lessons learned about entrepreneurship, about startups, about the tech industry that you look back on and think you carried with you in meaningful ways?
Yeah. So I would say the biggest lesson learned is that oftentimes the most successful founders are also the most difficult to work with, right? And so, if you think about some of the prominent founders and their reputations, they're really quite challenging in many different ways. And a lot of that comes from the intersection of the conviction around what we're doing and just an insistence on doing it in a certain way with very little tolerance for exception. So one of the things that I've tried to do as a founder, as opposed to as a executive, which is what I was in the two earlier companies that we talked about, is find a way to have both conviction and insistence and drive and expectations for the people that are on the team, but also be as human as possible about it, which I think is somewhat unusual in Silicon Valley. And it remains to be seen whether that is a success model or not. One of the things that we're quite proud of at Jupyter is that we've built a place that's very attractive to extremely smart people and have a really cohesive, strong culture. But, ultimately the results are what's going to matter.
Yeah. I want to start in on the Jupyter story, but obviously you hinted at this. To do that, we need to talk more about Zeus a little bit. So what was the idea for Zeus, and then how did that set the stage for Jupyter?
Yeah. So Zeus, the premise was that at that moment in time, almost 20 years ago, in the very early days of cloud computing, one could develop applications that ran in the cloud that previously were only possible on supercomputers or very expensive high performance compute infrastructures. And when we were starting it, we didn't really know what the application would be. We were basically saying, what are the set of applications that are significantly important from an economic perspective that require high performance computing. And we settled on weather forecasting. And the idea was that we could revolutionize weather forecasting. For a variety of reasons, as I mentioned earlier, we were a bit too early in terms of the cloud infrastructure that was available. One of the folks on the team actually, prior to joining the team, had written the CUDA code that's fundamental building block of what NVIDIA is doing now, almost 20 years later. And that code and some of the other things like it were very, very powerful, but they just weren't mature enough for a full stack solution that we were building.
So as we begin to pivot towards what becomes Jupiter, how did that evolve, and give us that kind of origin story?
So the three key folks at Zeus were myself, Eric Guan, and Josh Hacker. Josh Hacker is one of the world experts in weather modeling and prediction. He went off to the National Center for Atmospheric Research and actually continued working on a number of cloud-related concepts, including something called Big Weather Web, which was essentially the federal government's initiative to push weather applications to run in the cloud. And Eric Guan went to Google and ran some of the satellite observation infrastructure for their satellite business. And I went to an AI company called Kaggle, which was a pioneer in what was happening with AI in commercial applications. And about a decade later, we were all thinking about what to do next. Again, it's one of those things where timing and serendipity matter quite a bit. And we said, well, we don't think there's much right now for cloud computing and weather that's really going to move the needle, but there's a lot happening with climate change. I keep in mind this is 2016. The Paris Agreement had just been negotiated and executed. And people that were paying attention to climate change could see that it was already having an impact on assets and societies, but that it was going to get worse. And even with the Paris Agreement, it was going to continue to get worse in ways that most decision makers really didn't have any visibility into. And so we all, it's like the proverb of the elephant where one person touches the trunk and says, this is a snake, and somebody touches the tail and says, this is a horse, right? All three of us were kind of coming at this from our own lens of thinking about this issue, but we could see that it was going to be important. And a lot of the technology building blocks that we'd worked on, all of us for a good portion of our career, were going to come together and be required to understand what was happening in the impact of climate change, not how quickly was climate change occurring, which most of the world was really focused on that and understanding that and changing the trajectory. But given what the trajectory was actually going to be, what was the impact going to be on societies and companies and people?
So, it sets up the perfect question, which is, I guess, give us the elevator pitch for today. What is Jupiter Intelligence, and what gap are you there to fill?
So everyone on the planet needs to understand the impact that climate change is going to have on them. Whether it's government, a company, an individual, they're all impacted in some way. And Jupiter has the best solution in the world for helping those entities, regardless of who they are, understand the impact of climate change in terms that are relevant to them. So their specific ownership interests, whatever they are, whether it's a consumer with a house or a company with a factory or a government with lots of people that they need to figure out where to move them to get out of the way of climate change or how to protect them. And what places are the worst impacted and require the most attention. The big issue for Jupiter is actually not how widespread the need is, but it's more an awareness. So you may recall I was talking about awareness, right? And when we started the company 7 years ago, we had an idea of 10 different segments of the economy that would be most interested most quickly. We got about a third of those right. And so since then, basically what we've been very good at is finding the segments that have said, yeah, we now think climate change is going to be important to our business in some way or our society in some way, and they're ready to work with us. So it's actually less about the need and more about the awareness of the need.
Can you talk about that differentiation first? What are the three that you got right? And then do you have hypotheses as to what's missing from those that haven't come on board with the awareness yet? Or when you think about those verticals and how those segments of the business or consumer population have become adopters, like what can we distill from that?
Yeah. The one that we got right early on very quickly was the energy sector, both power generation and transmission, as well as, raw materials for producing energy. So oil, gas, solar, wind, and the like. That's probably the most salient. And the reality there was that was a sector that, for a variety of reasons that had very little to do with their asset exposure, were already quite sensitive to the impact of climate change because they were contributing to the impact of climate change. And over time, what we found is the things that are the most mission critical and the most expensive CapEx are the ones that kind of have been the earliest adopters. And then secondly, and we really didn't fully anticipate this when we started the company, was, essentially the whole system of financing that infrastructure in one way or another, which actually for us started out with consumer finance around mortgages and has spread into kind of every component of the financial services sector.
Both those are really interesting examples. I was just thinking back to a conversation I actually just had yesterday, and I heard a lot of folks recently from the legacy energy sector talking about that CapEx and the long-term investment strategy that they're now placing in new renewable infrastructure, and how more than anything else, they need certainty, policy certainty, that the major investments they're going to make in infrastructure, aren't going to be screwed up with policy changes here in DC where I live. So curious for your take on that. I mean, these are sectors and work that you're intimately familiar with, and curious how you think, both from your partners and clients' perspective, but also just from a modeling perspective, like how do we think about the variable uncertainty of like the policy world coming in and trying to keep changing things?
And I think one of the things that has become very clear to me is that the regulated entities care much more about consistency and uniformity than they do about the specific policy, right? Because policy volatility is very hard to plan for, and having to conform to different policies in the United States and Europe and, in different parts of Asia in particular is quite expensive. And so companies and industries really want consistency and uniformity, which I think the global regulatory environment has done a pretty poor job of. And, there's quite a bit of volatility, and that's held back quite a bit of capital investment versus what would have occurred to date.
Yeah. We've talked about just the importance of the product and service that you guys provide in a macro sense, no matter the vertical, no matter the sector, towards understanding risk management. And so I was hoping you could kind of help folks who may not be as familiar with the kind of some of the more specific concepts around risk mitigation, like outline for us how you guys think about and talk about risk management, and on your customer side, prediction and assessment of risk, and specifically climate risk right here. But how would you explain that to folks, help them understand kind of what this looks like?
Yeah. So I think the very first thing that's the building block to all of this is it goes back to the cost benefit analysis that we were talking about before, which is you've got an asset. Let's say it's a data center, right? A lot of our business is with data centers and the big data center companies. And you know that the computers operate in kind of a tolerance of certain thermal conditions. So, you don't want it to be too hot, and you also don't want it to be too cold, but that's changing, right? That's sort of the most fundamental building block of climate change is that's changing. You might build a data center that you expect to last for 20 years. And so understanding what the temperature conditions are going to be 20 years out and what that implies for cooling and energy costs has a pretty significant impact on how you think about where you're going to put the data center. Also, similarly, your energy costs, right? So a lot of data centers are now powered by hydroelectric. So if you've got changing precipitation patterns that might contribute to drought at different times during the year, it might mean irregular access to the hydroelectric power or just the cost of the hydroelectric power, because that's a supply-demand impact. So understanding all of that is critical to deciding where to site a data center, and then also how much to invest in the various different HVAC or your own dedicated energy supply, for example. And those are all capital decisions that all have return on investment or ROI characteristics. Similarly, if it's a power plant, that's subject to flooding that's going to take the power plant down for several days, which we've now seen in, the area around the Gulf of Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, which is where a significant amount of critical infrastructure for manufacturing in the United States exists. Then you need to anticipate how much flooding there's going to be over the life of that power plant and build the mitigation. So one of our customers, for example, literally built a concrete tabletop, right? 30 feet of concrete, and then built the power plant on top of the concrete tabletop because that was the right elevation for them to ensure that the power plant would basically be bone dry, right? The rest of the area around the power plant might be completely destroyed and rebuilt, but the power plant was going to keep operating. It's kind of like, those islands of houses that you sometimes see in the media where somebody built a moat around their house and the rest of the neighborhood's destroyed, but that one house is still standing. We're actually seeing kind of an increasing amount of that. And it's not cheap. That's like an extra $30 million in concrete and steel just for one single power plant. And that's happening all over the planet. And so our customers basically use Jupyter to decide how high to build based on the life of the asset and where it is.
When you think about those making major investment decisions without the benefit of this intelligence, are there any kinds of common misconceptions you've noticed when it comes to kind of the legacy analytics universe, miscalculating or misunderstanding or misappreciating the real climate risk that we might be looking at from a business investment perspective?
Yeah, this is a great question and really important. So when we first started talking to customers, many of them said, we have insurance for this risk, and we use insurance as a proxy for what the risk is going to be over the life of the asset. So you might have a 20-year asset, like I was talking about before, a data center, power generation, or even a home. Home's actually more like a 100-year asset when it's first built. And they're using the 1-year current risk estimate from their insurance to think about their risk over the life of that asset. And that assumption that you can use 1-year insurance as a proxy for risk over the life of the asset is based on an assumption that in the industry people call stationarity, right? Which is the underlying assumptions aren't changing. They're stationary. Conceptually, they're not moving, which is just wrong. And so if you take an asset that the company started thinking about designing 20 years ago, went through permitting, went through engineering, went through design, construction, it might take 15 years to build from the time they start thinking about it. Now, the asset has, let's say, a 30-year life. So the time horizon from when the assumptions were used for what the risk of that facility is going to be was 45 years before the end of life, the theoretical end of life of that asset, at a time when no one was even thinking about climate change. Right? And so all of that design and build for the last really 30 years is based on assumptions that are not valid. And if you take a greenfield asset and you do the same thing, you're going to actually just repeat the same process at a time when the climate is changing even faster than it has over the last 15 years. So this is a very, very dangerous approach. And I would say the engineering community in general, especially if you include things like building codes, is still in the infancy of addressing this particular issue.
How do we accelerate that? How do we get folks, because as you point out, not only is it now there's an awareness that's becoming more readily accepted by multiple stakeholders, but also the situation is fluidly changing today more than in the past. Not only is history is not the best judge of future performance, but future performance is actually changing more rapidly than we would have, I think, originally thought. So how do we get people engaged on this?
Yeah. So first of all, one thing I like to say is the present doesn't look like the past and the future looks even less like the past than we thought.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we notice pretty consistently is that executives over about 55, 5 years ago, I used to say 50, but now I say 55, right? That executives over about 55 really don't think about this issue and I'm not saying everyone, but the vast majority, it's just not one of the things that they naturally think about in their book of issues that they need to worry about. And executives kind of 45 and under, maybe 40 and under. I used to say 30 and under. Now I would say 40 and under. 40 and under think about this quite differently. So we see sort of a totally different mindset based on the age of the executives or government officials
Interesting.
that we're working with. That actually dominates, there's in the United States, this tends to be a bit of a red-blue issue as well. But if you look at the age of the person we're talking to, that actually has a much bigger impact than the political leanings of the person that we're talking to and how they think about this. And so there's a bit of a generational change that's starting. It's not quite as far along as it needs to be to really drive changes in behavior, but there's a huge inevitability to this just based on the way that different cohorts generationally are thinking about it.
That's really interesting. I also wonder, I know you guys have worked really hard to, simplify is not the right word, but make the interfaces and the outputs much easier to digest. I'm wondering if that's part of that, like wanting to make sure that the product that you're delivering has an easier digestion from older cohorts. I know you maybe talk about like the climate score or how you guys think about kind of presentation and interpretation of data so that it's applicable to folks or it resonates with folks no matter where they sit on that spectrum.
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's actually changed quite a bit since the company got started. So when we first started talking to potential customers, the ones that cared about climate change, which maybe was a third in some way, really just wanted to understand, well, okay, so what's really happening with climate change as opposed to making deep economic decisions about what they were going to do about it. They were largely still in survey mode. And so they wanted to know things like, how much flooding is there going to be? Right? And so the threshold question for them was, do I need to worry about this? And they were largely comfortable with kind of the physical impact of things like flood and fire and heat stress and the like. In the last 3-4 years, the market's matured a lot, and customers no longer are asking the question, do we even need to worry about this? But do we need to worry about this? And then if we do, where and what do we do? And what's material from an economic perspective? And so Jupyter added a pretty extensive layer of what we call economic impact functions, which are things like the probability of default on a loan or the average annual loss expected, which is a metric that's used in insurance, or the probability of supply chain disruption and how much of the supply chain is going to be disrupted. Now we have customers that are taking that and flowing that all the way through into the income statement or balance sheet of their financials. And so we've gradually moved up the stack. Now, I could say, that was just what we had to do from a technology perspective, because you can't say what the economic impact is without having really good physical risk inputs into the economic impact. But the reality was, at the same time that we were moving up the stack, the market was maturing in the way that they were thinking about it.
Yeah. I mean, just knowing your background, knowing how attuned you are to what's next in the emerging technology aspect, like what's the next product that you're elevating towards? How do you make this better, more intuitive, more, digestible, more easy to use for consumers? Like what's next on the horizon from an emerging tech perspective that you're excited about?
Yeah. So there are two big things on the horizon. One is there's sort of a growing set of regulations that require companies to understand and disclose what the impact of climate change is going to be on them. That doesn't really require a whole lot of technology from us. It just requires making our services super easy to use in that use case. The thing that, from a technology perspective, that we're quite excited about is generative AI. And we're using that in two ways. One is, effectively as an agent where somebody that knows very little about climate change can just ask very basic questions and get very quick answers and take the specialists out of the loop, which is going to be very important for the regulatory compliance component as well. And then the second is, if you go back to what I was describing before, where there's a lot of very sophisticated analytics on top of what we do, we're essentially automating the generation of Python code that takes hundreds of hours of software development out of the process for getting to the answer of what's actually most meaningful to the customer.
Can you give us on either example, but the first one I think maybe easier, like give us the prompt that, an illustrative prompt that you think someone would use and kind of the output then that they'll see. Because I think this is super exciting and I think really will make it obvious to folks and really exciting to folks.
Yeah. So a good one is, here's my portfolio of assets that I own, right? Which typically is going to be loaded as data by the customer. What do I need to worry about most from a climate change perspective and why?
Yeah.
Right? And then the answer you'll get is, these 3 locations are going to have the biggest economic impact. And, the impact is quantified by the algorithm. And then there's an explanation that this one is due to flood and this one is due to fire and this one is due to business interruption because of heat stress, right? Where you can't actually run the facility because it's too hot.
Yeah, it's so cool. I think that you can see immediately how folks are going to get really excited about this. In terms of just the business overall, you're sitting at the intersection of climate resilience. It is core to your business. Your entire mission and business plan are kind of aligned on that. So I'd love to get your perspective on how you thought about the integration of building a profitable business, but doing so with purpose, both at Jupiter, but even in your career in general, like how you kind of look at the intersection of profit and purpose.
Yeah, I would say Jupiter's really the first time where that's been an important criteria for me. Prior to Jupiter, it was more, what's exciting? What do I find interesting? Where do I think there's a big opportunity? I was at a point where when we started Jupiter, I had the luxury, if you will, I guess some people might even call it privilege, of saying, well, I can optimize on other things. And, it's pretty clear that climate change is going to have a dramatic impact and touch billions of lives over the course of the next decades, already has touched millions of lives, at least in ways that people weren't prepared for. And, I come from a private sector background. And so I naturally thought about this. You were asking before about leverage. I naturally thought about this as, well, how can you get a lot of capital to leverage to go tackle this problem, right? And investors are not charitable. There might be impact investors, but impact investors are still looking for return. And we, in Jupiter's cap table, we've got a mix of pure traditional equity investors and impact investors, but it's largely dominated by traditional investors in the sense that they're just looking to maximize their returns. But we said this is a very big problem. Everyone's going to care about it. And we can solve it in ways that deliver significant economic returns. And so we got the capital day one to go solve this tough problem. And we still had a lot less capital than the government entities, but we were so focused and doing it in a novel way that we were able to go much, much faster than the government entities. Right? And now that we're more established, we have a program called the Jupiter Promise. The Jupiter Promise basically means that we make our applications and data available to essentially nonprofit entities, typically NGOs, where they're going to use it for individuals and societies that otherwise wouldn't have access to this information. We figured out a way that we can make that information available in that context without it cannibalizing the part of the business that funds the development and generates the revenue. So it winds up not being material to the business results of the company. We think it has a pretty significant impact on people's lives. And one of the great things about that is a lot of people that come to work at Jupiter, they understand that we're a for-profit company and we need to generate returns and continue to attract capital. But at the same time, they have the opportunity to work on, not necessarily full-time, but as part of what they're doing, these very exciting, impactful projects around helping underserved communities prepare for climate change and invest in resilience, or even, in the natural environment, help to plan for saving endangered species or wildlife more generally.
Yeah. I love that. I was actually just about that. One of my next questions was to get you to talk to me about Jupiter Promise, because I think it's really cool. I mean, I also recognize that coming from your background in emerging tech and being now kind of entrenched in the climate space, a lot of folks I talk to on the capital market side really firmly believe that the next unicorns are coming out of climate tech, that this is a space where there's incredible opportunity. We need more capital, we need more innovation, and the products and services are going to be in demand, whether it's from the big asset managers that have too much capital on the line there's just so many use cases at this point. So I'm curious how you think about, or what your thoughts are on kind of this intersection. You, I'm sure, see new ideas, see new companies, hear new pitches, like you're steeped in this world. What's out there that's exciting you, or what are you hearing that you see potential in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one technology that really matters is energy storage, right? Which a lot of people refer to as batteries, right? And whoever kind of cracks the code at doing that at scale first, economically at scale, that's going to be a giant winner. And, at this point, I think it's still too early to say, this company's got it, but there's a tremendous amount of innovation going on in that area. And the fact of the matter is, things like EVs, at scale, EVs really matter only if we've solved the energy input, which requires storage, right? And then I think power production also matters quite a bit. It's not a big insight, but personally, I'm quite excited about what's happening with small nuclear. I think we've made a lot of progress on safety and production costs in that area.
Yeah, I think that's right. Do you have thoughts on how, kind of, again, thinking all the way back, coming full circle to academic life and studying, are there ways in which you see the policy ecosystem as potential input to provide the systems and structures that support those changes?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about the policy infrastructure before, and one of the things that I said was consistency is the thing that matters the most. So I still believe that. And I actually think that what's happening from a technology innovation perspective is largely going to occur regardless of what happens in the policy environment. Mm-hmm. But the policy environment will shape the pace of capital investment once the technology is proven out. And that's where it really matters.
Yeah. As we kind of wrap up a little bit, kind of a big picture question, did you think back, on a bunch of really amazing companies that you've helped to build and lead, think about where Jupiter's going next and the incredible potential there. What do you kind of hope your legacy looks like in the space?
Well, I mean, I think the most important thing is that we help the planet become more resilient. Earlier in the conversation, I said everyone on the planet needs to understand what the impact of climate change is going to be on them and what they can do about protecting themselves or their assets, right? And so, big success for us would be we've fundamentally changed the curve in how quickly the world does that.
Yeah. And I know it's not the easiest perspective to take on, but when you're working in the resilient space or constantly thinking about resilience, I think your eyes are trained towards the risk part, the scary part, the pessimistic part. I'm curious how you flip the script and, given what you know and given what you do, what is there to be optimistic about when it comes to the big challenges we face, like climate risk?
So I'm a student of history, and I have, sort of a fundamental view that if you look at the history of human civilization over the last 2,000 plus years, there's been a steady arc of more freedom, more knowledge, more health, greater longevity. Now that comes in fits and starts too, right? So, we had just in the last few years, we had a pretty significant setback from the pandemic. And in the 20th century, we had several global conflicts that were quite big setbacks for humanity, but we recovered from all of that. So, if you look at the way society tends to respond to very big challenges, it's slow, not enough. Something really bad happens, and then really fast. And, I think we're, unfortunately, on the one hand, we're on the verge of some really bad things happening. And that's ultimately going to result in a fundamental change in mindset, both around changing the vector of climate change as well as around mitigation. We're going to adapt really, really fast because Darwin always wins. Adapt or die.
Awesome. I think it's a great place to end. I love it. It's a great balanced perspective that has both the reality, but also some optimism in it. So where can folks learn more about Jupiter? Where do you want to send folks to read up or hear upcoming talks or, connect with what you guys are doing?
Yeah. Probably the best place is jupiterintel.com, JUPITERINTL.com. There's a wealth of information there, including links to other podcasts and articles, and a tremendous amount of information about what we're doing.
Awesome. And we'll have all this in the show notes too. But thanks so much for taking the time today. It was a lot of fun to chat.
Really a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Huge thanks to Rich Sorkin for joining us on Consensus in Conversation this week. To find out more about Jupiter, visit their website at jupiterintel.com. And we'll add links to their socials and more in the show notes so you can connect with them further. And also, make sure to check out their show notes on Spotify for this week's Q&A. Looking forward to seeing all your answers this week, so definitely take a moment to comment. As always, you can email us at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. You can also message me directly on LinkedIn and Threads at ckgaughan. That's at ckgaughan. Send us your questions, comments, ideas for future guests. We love getting your feedback. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please take a second to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It's so helpful with growing our reach and adding new people to the conversation. And it helps us to continue bringing you more awesome talks with the business leaders you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week with a brand new conversation. Consensus in Conversation is hosted and executive produced by me, Conor Gaughan. The episode was produced by Will Gatchell and Jeff Rock with editing from the good folks at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker, Greg Hergel on research, and Patrick Gallagher on strategy. Consensus in Conversation can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.